Hey everyone, Yui here. In this video, we'll be making a stylized mushroom house in Blender. I'm going to start off with the default scene, delete the camera and light, select the default cube and scale it a bit in the Y and a little in the X. Now in edit mode, select the top face and scale it in the X, duplicate it and make it smaller to create the smaller part of the house. To make a door, press Shift A and add a plane. Now scale it in the X and in edit mode, press Ctrl R to add vertical and horizontal loop cuts. You can use the mouse wheel to add more loop cuts. To create the longer alternating faces, select some of the edges and dissolve them by pressing Ctrl X. To make them into individual planks, select them all, right click and use Edge Split, which splits them into individual faces. And also added some thickness by extruding them upwards. Now I'm selecting some of the edges and vertices and sliding them around to create some gaps and variations in the wood. For the door frame, I duplicated a block, added some more thickness and scaled it to the size of the door. Then did the same for the top and the other side. For the windows, add a circle. Press E and S to extrude it inwards. Select the inner edge loop and duplicate it. Make it smaller and extrude it outwards for the inner frame. Now I'm selecting the alternating edges by selecting all the edges and choosing checker deselect. Then press Ctrl X to dissolve them so we have fewer faces. Now I'm extruding everything down to add some thickness and extruding the faces on 4 sides to create the grills. And for the glass, just added a circle and scale it so that it's slightly smaller than the outer frame. In edit mode, fill it with a single face by pressing F and parallel the glass to the window frame. Now I'm moving the window just above the door and in the middle of the house. I also duplicated the window and added it to the smaller part of the house. For the window holes, I duplicated an edge loop from the window and press P to separate it by selection. First select the edge loop, then the house and go to edit mode. In the front view, use mesh and knife project to project the edge loop onto the house and delete the face. After a while, I decided to open one of the windows. For that, I duplicated the outer face loop and extruded it to create the window's frame. To rotate about where the hinge is supposed to be, place the 3D cursor from where you want to rotate, then rotate the window with respect to the 3D cursor. And then I added a cylinder as a hinge. Select the top faces of the house for the roof, duplicate them and separate them by selection to make it their own objects. Then I extended them a bit and selected the bottom vertices and moved them inward to make a slight angle. And used a solidify modifier to add some thickness. Now that the roof's base is done, we need to add some roof tiles. I used a cube, scaled it in the X and Z into a tile shape and added some loop cuts using Ctrl R. You can create a chamfered edge by selecting a vertex and beveling it using Ctrl B, then pressing B. Now select some of the vertices and move them to create cracks and crevices. To add crevices, bevel the vertex, then use poke face to create a vertex in the middle. Move the middle vertex down and bring the side vertices closer. Then I created 2 more variations of the roof tiles by doing the same. Then I UV unwrap them by selecting certain faces and projecting from view for each side. Now I'm using a plane that is roughly the size of the roof so that it will be easier to place the tiles on. Then I duplicated the tiles, rotated them and created some randomness and filled up the whole plane. Added an empty and scaled it to the size of the roof. Then parented the tiles to the empty so that I can move all the tiles as a whole. Place them on the roof, adjusted some of the tiles so that they don't look as a line. Then using a mirror modifier with an empty as a mirror object, I mirrored one of the tiles to the other side. Then linked all the modified data using Ctrl L to the other tiles. I deleted some of the tiles and placed them on the smaller roof. To create the beam, I used the cube, made it smaller and scaled it to the size of the roof. Then added some loop cuts and scaled the front with proportional editing. For the wooden supports, I duplicated the edges from the house, separated them by selection and extruded and scaled to create a face. And then duplicated a face for the middle part, then added some thickness by extruding it. Also made a flower pot holder and some pots to which we will add some flowers later. Since it's a house, we need a chimney. So I added a cube, scaled it and added an edge loop and beveled the edge loop to create a face loop and extruded it outwards. For the top part, I used a cylinder, scaled the top face in edit mode to make it like a cone. Then added some edge loops and scaled it a bit with proportional editing on and added some thickness with solidify modifier. Now let's move on to making some props. Add a cube, insert it, and to make the X shape that you see in the crate, use poke faces to split each selected face into triangles. Then bevel it and select the faces except for the triangles and extrude it outwards. For the lamp post, add a cube and scale it except in Z using Shift Z. Now duplicate it and make it smaller for the top and the support piece. For the lamp, add a cube, make it smaller and add an edge loop in the middle. Now scale down the top and the bottom faces to make a lamp shape. Insert the faces on the sides and extrude it inwards for the glass and place the lamp on the lamp post. For the floorboards, similar to how I made the roof tiles, used a cube, added some loop cuts and made splits and cracks in the wood by beveling the edges. Then duplicated the planks and made some variations and placed them on the areas of the house. I then placed the crates and lamp on the floor. To add slight randomization to the rotation, go to Object, Transform and Randomize Transform and adjust the rotation in the axis you need. I also added some cubes, scaled them and added some edge loops to make some supports for the floor. Then I have duplicated them and rotated it around to make the other legs. Now let's make some mushrooms. I'm going to start off with a single vertex, extrude it a couple of times and with the house in view, place each vertex so that they look like they are growing close to the house. Now add a subdivision surface modifier to smooth out the edges and a skin modifier to add some thickness. Turn on smooth shading in skin modifier to shade smooth and another subsurf modifier to add more geometry. With proportional editing turned on, select the bottom vertex and press Ctrl A to scale the thickness. Also do the same for the top. For the mushroom top, I'm using a UV sphere that's fairly low poly, and in edit mode, delete the bottom faces and make it wider by scaling it. For the inner part, duplicate it and make it smaller, then select the bottom edges and press Alt F to fill it. Since we duplicated the original, the normals will most likely be flipped, so to check this, turn on face orientation in overlays. The red part indicates the flip normal, select it and press Ctrl Shift N to correct the normals. I deleted the faces in the middle and selected the inner loop Now with proportional editing, pull the vertices down and added a subsurf modifier. To connect the top of the stem, first we have to apply the modifiers on the stem by pressing Ctrl A and choosing Visual Geometry to mesh. Then delete the top faces and join the mushroom top and the stem together by using Ctrl J. Select the edges and use Alt F to bridge them together. Then I cleaned up some of the edges by selecting them and pressing Ctrl X. Slide the edge loops and scale them so that they have a smoother transition. I selected the top part and added some deformation to make it look more like a mushroom. Also created some more mushrooms to wrap around the house so that they would look like they are hugging the house. Also made some smaller mushrooms using the same technique and then use them to add stairs to the house and also scatter them around to fill up the scene. Before you add any IVs, first enable the IVGen add-on in Edit and Preferences. Then make a copy of everything, apply our modifiers and join them together into one mesh. Now place the 3D cursor where you want the IVs to generate from and click the Add New IV button in the IVGen panel. You might have to mess with the settings to get things right. And then I added IVs on the roof, big mushrooms, floor and the mushroom stairs. After I joined all the IVs and converted them to mesh and using a plane as leaves, added them to the vines using a particle system. For the tree, since I only needed the trunk, I used a cylinder and in edit mode moved up the top face in Z and scaled the bottom a little to create that gradient in thickness. Then I added some edge loops and made sure that we have rectangular faces and not square faces. So we have a stretched displacement. Now add a displacement modifier and create a new texture. In the texture tab, choose Musgrave texture and increase the size. Back in displacement modifier, reduce the strength to about maybe 0.3. The ground is just a large plane and added some loop cuts to make it into a square face and subdivided it a couple of times. Now I'm selecting a face with proportional editing turned on and moving them up to add some elevation. Did this with a couple more faces to get the overall ground. Added the trees and mushrooms by duplicating them a couple of times and placing them on the ground to fill up the composition. Now creating a path by painting it in vertex mode so I can use it as a mask while I'm texturing. Also create a vertex group for the leaves and debris on the path and one for the grass and plants. I only weight painted areas that were visible to the camera so I can minimize the particle count. For the grass and vegetation, I'm using an add-on called Grass Wall. Added some grass, some dandelions and plants and use the grass vertex group for the particles distribution. You can also do this with just the particle system. I'm just using this add-on for the assets it provides. I will also provide some vegetation assets that I created that you can use along with the project file, and you can download this for free from my Gumroad. First, add a particle system and increase the particle count. Now select the grass asset as the particles and enable advanced and randomize rotation and scale. Use the grass vertex group you created to control the distribution. This will probably be flat and uniform, so here's the trick. We can make grass patches by using a texture. In the texture section, add a texture and go to the texture tab. I'm using a cloud texture. You can use a different one and adjust the size, and in colors enable color ramp and bring the black and whites closer to create the patches. Now add another particle system with another grass asset, or make this one with a different color or size, and use the same texture but invert the colors to fill up the patches. Also change the influence in texture type to density and size. If you are getting in some kind of weirdness when adding a particle system, then you just need to apply the scale, rotation and location, and it will most probably fix it. I also moved some planks that were intersecting with the mushroom so that they would look like some extra planks on the sides. Also added some fallen planks on the ground. I used two different materials for the path and the grass. First I imported the ground materials by using Ctrl plus Shift D, which imports all the selected maps at once. Then I duplicated the principal BSDF and added another grass ground texture. Scale both the textures and mix them using a mix shader with the vertex color we made earlier as the mask. The tree material is just a bark texture connected to a principal BSDF. Added the ambient occlusion by connecting the AO texture to a mix node that was set to multiply. I first UV unwrapped the windows, beams and floor planks and rotated and scaled the UV so that they are all in the same direction as the wooden texture. I used the same tree bark texture for the wood and added a little yellowish tint using a mix node set to color blending mode. This same texture was applied for the wooden planks, light posts and crates. For the lamp, I added a metallic material to the frame and selected the inner faces and assigned a glass material to those planes. Also used an objective with emissive material for the lights inside the lamp. I used a yellowish brown as the base color for the house and added some dirt patches using a noise texture. I wanted to add a simple mossy material, so masked the bottom part using a separate XYZ node and mixed it with a noise texture set to dark and blending node. Also used a ambient occlusion node to add some moss in the crevices. I used the same bark texture as the trees for the doors and the windows with a slight color variation and applied a glass texture in the inner circle. For the base color of the roof, I used a dark shade of blue and a stretch noise texture to create some stripes and bands on the tile. Then I used an ambient occlusion node as mask to add some moss in between the tiles. To add edge wear, use a geometry node's normal input and a bevel node connected to a vector math node, and you can control the thickness using a color ramp and a bevel radius in the bevel node. I'm using the same texture as the house and the roof for the chimneys also. For the mushroom material, I use a separate XYZ node Z output to add a vertical gradient and a math node set to add to offset it. Using a color ramp, and I used a dark color at the bottom and a lighter tone at the top. We can add some texture using a noise texture and mixing them both using a mix node. I also added some dark spots with a word noise texture's distance output and two noise texture as a factor for the mix node to mask out areas I do not need. Since this is an imaginary mushroom, I have also added some subtle veins and I used the same gradient texture from before to mask out the stem. Used a combination of word noise texture and noise texture to create the vein patterns, and to add a little swirl we can mix the texture content with the noise texture with low factor. To mask the underneath part of the mushroom, use a geometry node with the normal connected to separate XYZ node and use the Z direction. I mixed it with the gradient from before to mask out parts of the stem. The grooves are created using a wave texture with polar coordinates angle connected to a vector and then fed to a bump map. I also added some subsurface and a mix shader with a translucent shader. For the smaller mushrooms, first I added some seams and UV unwrapped the mushroom model. Then aligned the UVs to an image texture of a mushroom. This texture was actually referred from a Gleb Alexandrov tutorial about lighting techniques. You can find the similar image texture from there, and the links to all the resources will be available in the description. I'm using a principal BSDF and connecting the mushroom image texture to the color socket. Also use the same image as a bump map and mix the principal BSDF with a translucent shader to add some translucency. Now I'm adding some subsurface scattering and setting the subsurface color to a slight yellowish tone. For the ivy leaves material, added a leaf texture and hooked up the alpha of the image to the alpha of the principal BSDF. To light up the scene, I first added an environment and in World tab of the shader editor, use the hue saturation node to desaturate it. Here's the scene with just the environment lights. Added some area lights and rotated it to point upwards to light up the underneath parts of the mushroom. Then I added some point lights and the area lights to light up the top and a spotlight with the plane in front of it. Here you can see how each lights react to the scene. The area lights lighting underneath the mushrooms, point lights acting as fill lights, and the area lights at the top adding a rim light. A spotlight with a high strength is used to add some directional lighting, and by using a plane as a light block or gobos, you can create light patches or gold rays. To do this, first select the light and enable use nodes in shader editor so you are able to add nodes. Add a noise texture and a texture coordinate and connect the normal coordinate to the vector input of the noise texture. Now the lights are actually a bit dim, so to increase the strength, add a map node set to multiply and crank up the value. Use a color ramp to crunch the black and whites to create the patches. Use the similar texture setup for the gobos but with a smaller scale value and the generated coordinates. Then use a mixed shader with the transparent BSDF and a diffuse node and fed the texture as a factor input to create the bigger patches. To make everything look instantly better, let's add depth of field. For that, add an empty to the point where you need the focus to be. Select the camera and in settings enable depth of field. Select the created empty as a focus object and change the f-stop value to maybe 0.2 or lower. Here's the final scene without any compositing. Now let's add some atmosphere using the mist pass. To set that up, enable it in the layer properties tab and in the viewport shading, change the combine to mist. To adjust the distance of the mist, go to the world tab and tweak the start and depth value. I ended up going with 28 as the start and 57 for the depth. Now let's move on to compositing. First render an image with the F12 and go to the compositing workspace. I have connected the mist pass to a denoising node as it had some noise. To add colors, I use a color ramp with a slide blue color. I also add another color ramp that would serve as the mask. I'm using a gamma node with a value of 2 and use the mask as a factor to a mixed node to darken the background. Then I combine the mist and the darkened background using a mixed node with a low factor value to add the background mist. After you're done with compositing, you can save the image either by re-rendering and saving it that way, or by changing to image editor and selecting the viewer node. Then in the image options you can use save as, rename and then save the image. I modeled some rabbits from a UV sphere and parented them to a simple rig. Then I animated a walk cycle and a jump animation in Action Editor by manually keyframing them, and an idle state using noise modifiers in the Graph Editor. Combined all of these animations in the non-linear editor and animated it along a path. Then I copied the rabbits and added them around the scene. Then I rendered them as a PNG sequence and also rendered some particles to show some wind movement. In After Effects, imported the PNG sequence and the render image, created a new composition and placed them and color matched all of them to the scene. added some goat rays using a fractal noise and a directional blur, then color corrected the entire scene and rendered it out. Here's the final output after all of the compositing. I hope you have learned something new, and if you love the content, do like and share. Comment down below if you want to ask me anything or connect with me on Discord. Also, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.